Okay, last section on federalism. I had already talked about how this beginning part, so we will go into the federal system right here. The federal system in America decentralizes our politics, so it takes from the center. Voters elect senators as representatives of individual states, not the entire nation. Different interests are concentrated in different states: energy in Texas, citrus in Florida and California, copper in Montana. The federal system allows an interest concentrated in a state to exercise substantial influence in the election of that state's officials, both local and national. Auto industry for Michigan, as well as agriculture. We have a lot of ag. In turn, these officials promote policies advantageous to the interests in both the state capital and Washington. This is a pluralism of interests that James Madison, among others, valued within a large republic. So that's the positive. We have everything's divided up by states. Different states have different interests, different issues. They hire by voting the people that will support those interests in Washington. Moreover, by ensuring that most disputes over policy are handled at the state and local levels, federalism reduces conflict at the national level, making democracy more effective. By the way, and that's what's interesting, when you watch the news, you're often watching local or state issues, and it's getting this feeling, this vibe like it's a national one, but it's not. It is, it's a state issue or a local issue. If every issue, what's going on, what happens in Seattle, Washington, and whatever issues they have are being dealt with Seattle, but if it shows up in the national news, we all tend to feel, not rationally necessarily, that that's affecting us. They claim that the national government be overwhelmed. Again, if every issue had to be resolved in Washington, national government would be overwhelmed. That's an opinion. Not saying they're wrong. I'm just noting opinions. In providing for decision-making at the state level, federalism allows for a diversity of policy choices among the states. Thus, states can better reflect the preferences of majorities of their citizens. If the citizens of Texas wish to have a death penalty, for example, they can vote for politicians who support it, even if other states move to abolish the death penalty. The problem with this, though, it's happening in some states, is like they're divided. Michigan has the Republican west side and the Democratic southeast side, and I think Colorado is becoming more and more blue, but they have a strong Republican history. So I see more division. I think poli-sci people see more division of rural versus city suburb. Versus state versus other state. So there are people in Colorado have more in common with people in Texas or even in Northern Virginia, actually maybe more Western Virginia, than they do with the other members of residents of their own state. So I don't know how this is. I think you could debate some of this. In addition, the more levels of government, the more opportunity there are for people to participate in politics. That is true. You can participate at the Fruitport level, Muskegon County level, state level, and obviously national. State and local governments provide thousands of elected offices for which citizens may vote and or run. Additional levels of government also contribute to democracy by increasing access to government. Some citizens and interest groups are likely to have better access to state-level government. No, remember interest groups, the MEA, the teachers union, the MEA is active at the state level. They are interested predominantly with how the state laws, new state laws, state funding, etc. Of course, from grant money that has already been discussed, federal plays into that too. And others to the national government. So the two levels increase the opportunity for government to be responsive to demand for policies. For example, in the 50s and 60s, when advocates of civil rights found themselves stymied in southern states, they turned to the national government for help in achieving racial equality. They went to the courts, Brown v. Board, some other court cases, and they went obviously to Congress and got the Civil Rights Act of 64. Business interests, on the other hand, have traditionally found state governments to be more responsive than the national government to their demands. Organized labor is not well established in some states. That's unions. But it can usually depend on some sympathetic officials at the national level to champion its proposals. This is a good take on the idea of, there are many places either to be very successful or to fail. And you will have to choose. Are you going to the state or are you going to the national? Another advantage of federalism for democracy is that even if a party loses at the national level, it can rebuild in its areas of strength and develop leaders under its banner at the state and local levels. As a result, losing an election becomes more acceptable and the peaceful transfer of power is more probable. The ability to rebuild politically at the state and local level was especially important in the early years of the nation, before our political norms had become firmly established. You talk about the president's election all the time, and sure, Biden won Michigan. Gary Peters, Democrat senator, won Michigan. But Republicans are still the winners of control of our state legislature in Lansing. It's not, we put so much emphasis on the presidency, but many Republicans, there was actually an increase of Republican representation across this country at other levels, including the U.S. House of Representatives, but also at the state levels. So the president is not the only one running. And it is true that, you might be talking about, well, why did this person win or lose the presidency? But take a look at, because we have a federalist system, who's winning and losing at the local levels, at the state level. They have a lot of power as well, in position of authority in lawmaking and law enforcement as well. Despite these advantages, sometimes the decentralization of politics can be a detriment to democracy. Even the presidential election, choosing a leader for the national government, is actually 51 presidential elections, one in each state and one in Washington, D.C. It is possible, as happened in 2000, for a candidate to receive the most popular votes in the country to lose the election because of the way in which the Constitution distributes electoral votes by state. Such a result is questionable contribution to democracy. And that's true, but I don't know if that's really federalism. That's just electoral college. Federalism may also have a negative effect on democracy insofar as local interests are able to thwart national majority support of certain policies. As we discussed earlier in the chapter, in the 60s, the states, especially those in the South, became battlegrounds when the national government tried to enforce national civil rights laws and court decisions. Federalism complicated and delayed efforts to end racial discrimination because state and local governments were responsible for public education and voting eligibility, for example, and because they had passed most of the laws supporting racial segregation. I love they say this like they say here, end discrimination like it happened. Keep in mind, this is still an ongoing fight, this racial discrimination. This did not end in the 60s. Again, an example of how history isn't so cut and dry. Having said that, though, this again is an example I brought up before. People tend to support federalism, or what they will call states' rights, when they don't want what the national government wants them to do. And they'll say, you don't have a right to do that, and vice versa. And I have seen through the years this happen significantly in the South, because the South tends to really be different about how it chooses to enforce laws, not only discriminate civil rights, but also environmental laws as well. But liberal or more left-leaning views, where they typically, like the national government, will prefer federalism or states' rights as well when they aren't liking what the national government's doing. That's essentially what they're saying here. And I brought this up before many times. At last count, there was an astonishing 89,000 plus American governments. The sheer number of governments in the U.S. is at times as much a burden as a boon to democracy. The relationships between governments at the local, state, and national level often confuse Americans, which is true. I don't know if it confuses them or we just don't pay attention enough. These confusions stem from the complexities of the relationships, Locally elected school boards run neighborhood schools, but the schools also receive state and national funds. And with those funds come state and national rules and regulations. Local airports, sewage, they really like to bring up sewage systems. I don't know if you've noticed that. Pollution control systems and police departments also receive a mix of local, state, and national funds. So they operate under a complex web of rules and regulations imposed by each level of government. I laugh at the sewage, but this is very key to a modern society. Your ability to move human waste is incredibly important, not only for quality of life, but for disease control in a society. Americans often speak eloquently about their state and local governments as grassroots governments. Grassroots means from the people, from the average people. It's grassroots. They can grass, right? The roots. So they start at the bottom with the regular people, close to the people. Yet having so many governments makes it difficult to know which levels are doing what. Exercising democratic control over them is even more difficult. Voter turnout in local elections is often less than 20%. Americans, and this is a media issue, tend to spend way more energy thinking at national level, thinking about the president in particular. Remember, the president is the only position that every American participates in voting up for or could participate. And so he is a major part of media and binds us together across the entire country. But I would argue, relentlessly going to argue with you, that state and local is vital to your day-to-day living. And yet no one pays, very few pay attention to what your city's, or in your case, township is doing, what your school board can do. The school board is making the decision ultimately, if aside from the governor, on what rules we're following for COVID. And who's on your school board and what is their viewpoints and agenda? What is your drain commissioner? Who is your drain commissioner? What is your state representatives fighting for in Lansing? It's a big deal, yet we don't tend to pay much attention to it. So federalism's great, but not so great given that we aren't really that involved in the democracy aspect of our government. We don't vote. In establishing a federal republic, the founders, quote, left a legacy of unending struggle between the central government and the state governments. Whoever said that. To address the question of the appropriate scope of the national government, we must first understand why it grew and then ask whether this growth was an expense of the states or occurred because of the unique capabilities and responsibilities of the national government. Consider first the economic domain and a few examples of the national government's intervention to help American business. Reagan negotiated quotas on imports of Japanese cars. Airplanes were grounded after the terrorist attack. Congress approved subsidies for the faltering airlines after that. In 2008, with the onset of the Great Recession, George W. obtained extensive authority for the federal government to intervene and subsidize financial institutions and automakers. Policies Obama continued. In each of these cases and dozens of others, the national government has involved itself, some may say interfered, in the economic marketplace with quotas, subsidies, and regulations intended to help American businesses. From the very founding of the republic, the national government took a direct interest in economic affairs. As the U.S. industrialized, new problems arose, and with them, new demands for governmental action. The national government responded with a national banking system, subsidies for railroads and airlines, and a host of other policies that dramatically increased its role in the economy. The industrialization of the country raised other issues as well. Formation of large corporations in the late 19th century came the potential for such abuses as monopoly pricing. Theodore Roosevelt was big on that, fighting that. If there's only one railroad in town, it can charge farmers inflated prices to ship their grains to market. Remember, I said that before. That was one of the starts of the Commerce Clause use, was regulating railroads. If a single company distributes most of the gasoline in the country, it can set the price at which gasoline sells. Thus, many interests ask the national government to restrain monopolies and encourage open competition. Do public farmers sought services such as agricultural research, rural electrification, price supports. Unions wanted the national government to protect their rights to organize and bargain collectively and to help provide safer working conditions, a minimum wage, pension protection. Together with other groups, they pushed for a wide range of social welfare programs, policies from education to healthcare that would benefit the average worker. Urbanization, that's creation of cities, the increase of cities, brought new problems in the areas of housing, welfare, environment, transportation, etc. Why not turn to the state governments instead? The answer is in most cases simple. A problem or policy requires the authority and resources of the national government. To deal with it otherwise would be at best inefficient. That's the argument anyway. The Constitution forbids states from having independent defense policies. But even if it did not, how many states would want to take on responsibility that represents more than half the federal workforce and about 1/5 of federal expenditures? The defense industry. Defense spending goes, remember, it doesn't go all to the troops. It goes to supplies. It goes to ammunitions. It goes to weaponry. And those are all factories and companies and research, etc. It would not be sensible for the states to handle a wide range of other issues. Again, that's opinion. It would make little sense for Louisiana to pass strict controls on polluting the Mississippi River. If most of the river pollution occurs upstream, where Louisiana has no jurisdiction, Rhode Island doesn't have an incentive for energy. But this one, Louisiana, is interesting because Louisiana, there's actually an area of the rivers down Louisiana where a lot of, I guess, chemical companies and companies that are on there because they pollute, because Louisiana is so liberal on pollution laws that moving down there and using the river down there has led to a lot of environmental problems and would be a good example of federal state rights versus federal. Should the federal government go into Louisiana? You can't allow all that. You're polluting it. The answer might be different. What they're suggesting here, anyway, if it was up in Minnesota. Minnesota was polluting it, and all the other states were being affected. Louisiana companies in Louisiana are polluting it, and that's affecting the workers there, the communities there, but then it just goes off into the Gulf. Similarly, how effectively can any state regulate an international conglomerate such as GM? How can each state acting individually manage the nation's money supply? Although states could, in theory, or in hypothesis, have their own space programs, it is much more efficient for for one national program. The largest category of federal expenditures is that for economic security, including the Social Security program. If each state had its own retirement program, would retirees who moved to Florida or Arizona be paid by their new state or the state they moved from? A national program is the only feasible method of ensuring the incomes of the mobile elderly of today's society. That, again, is opinion. That is an argument that's going on with healthcare. Should we have a national healthcare program, or should states do it? There are states that have good, strong healthcare programs. Hawaii is one of them, where they provide healthcare much better than some states that didn't even opt into Medicaid expansion. Michigan I would bet, is in the middle as far as healthcare. But should that be a state issue? Should that be a national issue? And then the liberals, if you listen to like a Bernie Sanders, and the Bernie Sanders supporters would argue a lot of these policies have really been concentrated in this American business, that really the national government has not prioritized helping quote unquote average workers' needs. That has been much more, and this would be an example of elite theory, remember that, on interest groups, that really all of these actions are state and national have benefited the elite interest groups. You could also argue a lot of all of this, because there's so much of it, is hyperpluralism as well. Everyone's getting something. Or you could argue it's pluralism. Our government works well because so many places and so many ways to allow different interests to have a say. They talk about how it grows. Their initial question, they say the federal government has not supplemented the states. I think COVID is a really good example of that. So many different policies happening under different attitudes and ideas about COVID and safety precautions and what gets closed down and mask mandates. But it's also a good example of there are people wanting it to be a national program and they want national leadership. And then others pushing back and say, no, let the states run their own programs. And the others would say, but the national government is the one with the money and the power to push for better control of the virus. Others would say, well, yeah, but different states have different needs and they should not have their power stripped from them from a national program. And whether or not the national government could even do a mask mandate or some of the closing of businesses. Would they even have a right to do that under the Constitution? And then finally, you do see it with vaccines, though. There does seem to be consensus that a vaccine movement should be done at the national level. But the states are all gearing up on how to roll out these vaccines as well. So it's a great example of federalism at work, hopefully in the best of ways. The states carry out virtually all the functions they always have. What has occurred instead is that with the support of the American people, the national government, possessing unique capacities, has taken on new responsibilities. In addition, the national government has added programs to help the states meet their own responsibilities. And we will leave this chapter at that.